Okay, so today we'll be talking about renewable fuel standards and the low carbon fuel standards, kind of at a high level, similar types of policies, but yeah, when we get down to it, very sort of different goals, and the mechanisms are a little bit different as well. I guess quick poll, who have heard of these policies before? A handful of people. Okay, cool. About 50-50. Okay. Oh. Don't know why that's happening. Okay, but here we go. Okay. So as we think about transitioning away from gasoline and going to potentially a bunch of alternative fuels, so there do exist some sort of natural gas ones. We've talked a lot about electric vehicles already, and a little bit about hydrogen vehicles. And today with the RFS, we'll mainly be focusing on biofuels policy, and then with the LCFS, thinking about this sort of general transition. Okay, so renewable fuel standard, what is it? So this was during Bush's first administration, or sorry, the Bush Jr.'s administration, the second Bush, enacted within the Energy Policy Act of 2005 and extended during the same administration. So essentially what this does is it blends, well, what we'll call quote unquote renewable fuel into transportation fuels. And the idea is to increase in the sort of quantity for these blends up to 36 billion gallons by 2022. And to give some perspective about the proportion of total gasoline consumed by the US, it's about 150 billion gallons per year. So this is a pretty substantial quantity of that. And we'll see how some of the goals to hit these volumetric targets have changed over time. The regulation itself, or the legislation, is both administered and regulated by the EPA with the goal of decreasing dependence on petroleum and reducing greenhouse gases from fuel use. So this is kind of right in line with, if you remember from last time, the CAFE standards. This 150 billion gallons a year, the more we're able to sort of decrease that, whether it be through fuel efficiency improvements or through use of alternative fuels, such as these renewable fuels, then it's better for the national security in the sense that you don't have to rely so much on imports. And then on the sort of climate change end, more sustainable. Okay, so this is a slide of the initial targets coming out of the sort of first instantiation of RPS. Okay, and so what's happening here is that sort of year by year, as we move forward, the amount of biofuels, so it's mainly going to be two sources, production of ethanol for blending with gasoline, and then biodiesel, which is sort of a direct replacement of existing diesel. And so these two sources are supposed to grow over time. And then the source of the biofuels is coming from three different areas. So at the time that it was first implemented, almost all of the ethanol is basically just coming from corn ethanol. Okay, and so that's what we call conventional. And then there are other sources in the other advanced. So this might be coming from things like sugar canes and switchgrasses. And then lastly, you've got cellulosic ethanol, which is coming from biofuels or biomass that needs to be sort of broken down, that have a lot of lignin that needs to be sort of separated from the parts that can be converted into ethanol. So the process itself to produce these is a lot more complex and therefore more expensive. But the idea is, as the sort of industry grows, it gives enough time for that to sort of take off. Okay. So the way that the renewable fuel standard works is with tradable credits. So basically, every single gallon of biofuel generates what's known as a renewable identification number. This is called a RIN. So anyone who sells petroleum, okay, so gasoline, needs to turn into the EPA a certain number of RINs for every single gallon that they sell. Okay, and so if I am a seller of gasoline, you know, for every gallon of gasoline I sell, maybe I need to produce like some X amount of RINs. And I, as the seller of petroleum, do not necessarily need to be the producer of the biofuel. Okay, I can buy those credits from the producers. So in this market, right, you have, you know, prices set by supply and demand for those RINs, and that's the way that you can ensure that you are injecting these renewable fuels into the sort of fuel use economy. And the number of RINs that the petroleum seller needs to submit to the EPA every year is going to increase marginally, right, as my targets go up. Okay, so here we can see the historical prices of ethanol. And the different colors refer to the sort of different types that I was referring to. So the blue line is the cellulosic. That's kind of the sort of hardest and most expensive to produce. And then the green line is biodiesel. And then you have advanced and renewable. So the renewable is just the conventional. And you can see sort of at the beginning, the sort of price discrepancy. And for the most part, your conventional stays a little bit cheaper than the other types of biofuels, and the cellulosic tends to be a little bit more expensive. Note, these are the RIN prices by the credit. If you adjust these sort of upwards to be sort of equivalent to gasoline, they'll be a little bit more expensive. Yeah, that's right. So on a per gallon basis, it has to get adjusted upwards, and then because the energy density of like ethanol is lower than gasoline, if you want to make it equivalent to gasoline as well, there's another sort of small adjustment. Okay. So this is like ancient history now, but this was very much a big issue a decade ago. there was this idea or problem known as the blend wall. I don't know if anyone has ever heard of this, but the basic idea is that there was, so okay, let me set the sort of political context about this. So you can imagine the oil industry is a big sort of big entity. There are a lot of players in it, and there's a lot of money in it, right? If you sell 150 billion gallons a year, and you start taking out sort of a noticeable chunk of that, that's a lot of money, right? And so when we think about RFS, you know, who stands to benefit? Yeah, all those farmers producing the crops that will go to be produced as biofuels, and all the, you know, people who do involved in the process of creating biofuels. And then who are the big losers? Yeah, the oil companies, right? So you can imagine, right? So American Petroleum Institute and the American fuel petrochemical manufacturers, they don't like the RFS, obviously. It loses them a lot of money. And so they try to reduce the requirements back in 2013, 2014 time period. And the argument was that that the vehicles should not exceed 10% blend of ethanol. And that the only way to do this was to either require more E85 sales, so both on the vehicle side and on the fueling side, and then to also have a higher consumption of biodiesel. And this 10% worry has to do with the fact that they don't think you can get to higher than 10% ethanol without suffering sort of efficiency losses in your engine, or leading to potential sort of negative effects on a gasoline engine. And people hadn't really done a lot of sort of investigation at that point in time about this. Okay, actually, so I should mention, okay, so E85, 85% ethanol, and maybe we talked about this, but there are a whole bunch of vehicles sort of out there on the road that are actually able to do this. So these are called flex fuel vehicles. So maybe you've seen this little insignia, or I think some of them have like a partial zero emission vehicle or low emission vehicle, little sort of badge. And so these vehicles are pretty much identical to gasoline vehicles, with just slight modification to prevent ethanol from corroding some of the like rubber gaskets and that sort of thing. But otherwise, they are capable of, they're more than capable of driving on E85. So there's millions of these guys sort of out on the road. It's actually, there's more of these than even sort of electric vehicles. But the reason why they don't sort of make the news as kind of this alternative fuel vehicle is that most people who have these cars don't even know that they have them. You know, flex fuel vehicles are, for all intents and purposes, are the same as a gas car. Most people kind of live on the coasts, right? And most of the biofuels are produced in the center of the country, and there isn't a widespread availability of E85 that people with flex fuel vehicles can even take advantage of. Okay. Yes.
So in modeling, is it percentage to a higher percentage number by
Percentage of what?
10% of biodiesel that can be blended into. Could you change that?
Yeah. So okay. Well. Yeah. This is not so much having to do with modeling yet. I would say the question of whether or not you can get higher than sort of 10% blending of ethanol into gasoline is more of like a sort of engineering question of whether or not vehicles are just even capable of doing that. And basically, yeah, so the argument that we should use E85 basically was not a good one. Okay, so the Department of Energy said that sort of getting past the blend wall does not require a lot more sort of flex fuel vehicles and a lot more provision of this high concentration of ethanol fuel. Less than 1% of annual gas demand is coming from E85, right? So very small amount. Yeah.
So I guess like given how many vehicles can use E85, I'm kind of wondering why is it that so few people use it? It's a lot cheaper in California, it's like $3 a gallon, $4.50. So even if you like slightly more out of your way, it's like pretty good savings. You can.
So the savings are not necessarily better, that's because even though it looks cheaper than gasoline on a per gallon basis, yeah, the energy content of the ethanol is much lower, and so to make it up, there's some multiplicative factor that usually makes it a little bit more expensive than gasoline. I don't know if that's still the case right now, but generally it's going to be a little bit more expensive. But probably the bigger issue is the logistics of getting that fuel. Yeah, I guess if you basically were to try and switch, if you were trying to switch everyone over to ethanol right away, there's probably a lot of supply constraints sort of preventing that from happening. And maybe those could get worked out. And we'll see an example of places that actually are sort of more dominant in terms of biofuels. But yeah, the sort of economics really kind of prevent that from happening. So this particular worry about the blend wall really kind of just came and went. So in 2016, we can see sort of the average percentage of ethanol within the gasoline across all of these states, kind of just breezing right by 10%, right? And yeah, if you think about it, like there's no physical reason why 10% is right at the sort of barrier. And in fact, these days, we're all the way up to kind of 15%, especially in California, where, yeah, there are sort of other policies in place that we'll talk about. Yeah, and it really sort of hasn't been a sort of major issue for gasoline vehicles. Yeah.
Do you think there could be like a political pattern to this?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah, because I'm looking at some of the states that probably have good resources to ultimately. But then on the other hand, it's all the ones that really are past 10% are in such a short or a small like fraction of each other that I don't know, it makes, at least to me, the political pattern less obvious.
This probably has to do more with the fact that the supply of oil is coming from certain places, and then that's just going to get blended. But I can tell you right now that all the states are well past 10%. Yeah. This was like right at the time where people weren't sure, and then they were starting to pass it, and these states were the ones that happened to be first. Yeah. Okay, but all those biofuels production still coming from sort of traditional, conventional sources, such as corn. And cellulosic ethanol sort of never really panned out to be very successful. And so EPA actually ended up changing the volume obligations. You can see the expectation sort of going out through these years was this growth in cellulosic ethanol, and that never really happened. And so as a result, it was getting sort of harder and harder to meet some of those requirements. And so you can see that the volume obligations for cellulosic ethanol has remained sort of very low after the requirements were changed. There was growth in some of the other ones. So you can see both the advanced biofuels category as well as the biodiesel did grow relative to what was in the sort of original obligations. And I'll also note that the total amount decreased as a result. So whatever the obligations were before, that the total volume, because they took out the cellulosic, has decreased. So you can see sort of on the axes. So this one, 2018 goes, and the original one is kind of between 24 and 30, but and the newer obligations is lower than 20. Okay, so compare this to Brazil. This is the sort of proportion of vehicles. So the flex fuel vehicles are the ones that are able to do E85. And you can see that the vast majority of vehicles over actually a relatively short time period were able to switch over. Oh, okay. So yeah, so Brazil is this kind of interesting case study, slightly different, where they are actually able to use and employ not only a large volume of the vehicles, but also most of the fuel that they consume is E85. 85% ethanol and 15% gas, as opposed to E15, which is what most people use today. 85% gas and 15% ethanol. Not really. I mean, yes, but it's to change from a gas car to a flex fuel vehicle, it costs the automaker like $150. Basically, the sort of O-rings on your on the sort of fuel lines need to be changed because the ethanol will dissolve sort of traditional rubber gaskets. But yeah, other than that, not much of a difference. you can do a little bit of optimizing in the sort of combustion process, but actually it's pretty similar. Yeah. Okay, so as we were mentioning, pretty political. So you get a lot of support from farmers, right? They make a lot of money from this, and a lot of subsidies and incentives to get them to produce this stuff. And oil companies are definitely not in favor of RFS because they make a lot less money. Yeah, if you think about the obligations, the original obligations in 2022, 36 million out of 150. So you just straight up lose like a fifth of your profits, right? More than that, maybe a quarter of your profits. Okay, so what sort of modeling issues are there? There are a lot of issues requiring sort of quantitative analysis, both to help the sort of formation of the policy and helping to understand impacts of the policy. Yeah, so I don't have specific slides about some of the more recent things, but I can tell you that, so RFS, similar to CAFE, they need updates to the regulation. And so one of the sort of big updates for RFS is probably going to be happening soon. And there's definitely already discussions that we've been having with the EPA about how you might want to consider including electricity produced from biofuels within the scheme of what RPS kind of sort of mandates as one of the sort of ways to meet the volumetric requirements. And so that whole process has been pretty interesting, and how you would go about sort of modeling that to come up with expectations for the volumetric requirements. Yeah, I think that on that end, it's pretty small because you don't have a huge amount of electricity produced from these sources, but nevertheless, right, they're trying to be comprehensive in thinking about the fuel use here. Okay, so emissions associated with use of renewables. One of the big ones, and we're going to talk a lot more about this, particularly with LCFS, is how does RFS affect the price of corn? And so there's this trade-off, right, between farmers who want to produce crops in order to satisfy food demand compared to fuel. And so what does that mean to sort of the prices of food goods as you have something like RFS? And these are sort of typical questions that can be brought about to understand some of these impacts and conducted through some modeling efforts, right? Okay, so let's take a look at this. So RFS emissions. Yeah, so this is a chart put together. I think this was done by Rand, but this was a kind of survey of a couple different studies which looked at modeling estimates of emissions. And the way that we're going to look at this, so this is this shaded area is for corn ethanol, and then two other sources from sugarcane and from soybean. The sugarcane is one of the advanced biofuels, and then the diesel is one of the biodiesel sources. This zero line here is an indication of a baseline of either gasoline for the two on the left or diesel for the one on the right. And so if you are below the 0 line, then you have less emissions than gasoline. And if you're above it, then you have more emissions than gasoline. And you can imagine this is pretty important, right? Because if we want to replace this alternative fuel, or if we want to replace gasoline with this alternative fuel, and we're thinking about sort of climate change impacts, you want to be sure that it's sort of always below the line. And you'll notice, okay, so EPA, National Research Council, and this is a study from Argonne, I believe, are all sort of have values, or I should say EPA and Argonne both have values sort of default below gasoline, but then the NRC and the study out of Carnegie Mellon both had emissions higher than that. And so why is that happening? What sort of assumptions are going into these models, right? These are going to be important to really sort of understand which one is better at the end of the day. Okay, so a lot of these studies have to do life cycle analysis, right? And so this is sort of understanding sort of all portions of the sort of life cycle use and production of these fuels. So for example, here, this is what we call sort of boundary conditions for your LCA analysis. This determines sort of what aspects of the lifetime that you use. And you can imagine that if in an LCA, that if that boundary is drawn differently in different studies, right, it can lead to slightly different answers. And so in this particular study, right, you can see what things are sort of included in the analysis, and that can partially explain some of the differences between modeling studies about why you might have higher or lower emissions. So this includes things like determining fuel yields, land use change, feedstock production, transportation of the feedstock, and then ultimately sort of fuel production. And this land use change is going to end up being a sort of particularly important and also somewhat controversial one. Okay, any questions about this? Yeah.
Model doesn't seem to be showing the combustion that like you're considering it in terms of the energy.
Yeah, so I don't remember exactly all the things that are in the study. This might just be part of the boundary, but what I'll say is that oftentimes in the sort of circular use ones, you balance out the combustion with growth of the feedstock, and then there are additional things associated with the production methods that end up increasing it. Yeah, so I don't know if that's exactly what's happening here, but the use phase is almost certainly considered in some way. Yeah. Okay, so these two plots are coming from this Carnegie Mellon study, and actually these are sort of similar types of plots. So let's go from sort of left to right. The greenhouse gas emissions of different feedstocks are shown here, with the sort of triangle indicating the net emissions. And then you have a baseline of gasoline at 93 grams per megajoule of fuel. And so if your triangle is below that, then your ethanol has lower carbon emissions. And if it's above that, then it has higher carbon emissions. And you can see the sort of components of this, right? There's the sort of distribution, production. You have some negative amounts, and this is going to be from the carbon sequestration, right, from growing the crop. And then I guess there's some production credits that you get for that as well. Production credit, I don't know why that wouldn't actually just be considered part of the sequestration. It might be an artificial thing having to do with credits that you get for growing the crop. I'm actually not 100% sure on that. Okay. So what's the big difference between the switchgrass feedstock and corn feedstock? Anyone see? Yeah, it's this red bar here, right? And so there's actually two forms of land use change. There's so DLUC, which stands for direct land use change, and then ILUC, which stands for indirect land use change. And what I can tell you is that the other studies, so if I go back really quick, so this study and this study don't actually include indirect land use change. And we're going to talk in a lot more detail about indirect land use change in a little bit. But this is the idea that as I sort of set aside crops, growing corn, let's say in the United States, to now produce fuel, there needs to be replacement for all of that demand of that crop for other uses, such as like feedstock for cattle. And so what ends up happening is, okay, what happens if now that demand is replaced by another country that that may induce land use change in some of those other countries? What are the impacts associated with that? And so the big one here is sort of working out how the agricultural markets would essentially lead to production of corn to meet some of those demands from Brazil, where they have a lot more sort of deforestation of of rainforests. And so that is kind of why this bar is so large. And you can imagine that in itself is sort of difficult to prove as sort of a counterfactual and actually pretty controversial. Yeah.
I need to live in a but do you know from the life cycle standpoint what like how far down the chain they go? Because I know direct land in LCA is like broken into grading and different types of land. So for indirect, they do that as well.
Yeah, for sure. They get into a lot of detail there, and they kind of have to make sure that they get as accurate as possible with some of these numbers. So the indirect land use change is really going to be the thing that makes or breaks the difference between whether it's better than gasoline or worse than gasoline. And a lot of the assumptions that go into the individual determinants of each of these are actually, right, so this is done through a Monte Carlo simulation, right, which hopefully everyone is familiar with at this point, since you guys are all doing it on your homeworks right now anyways. So you can see the kind of results they give the sort of distribution of emissions, and you can see here, this is the sort of gasoline break-even points, and you can see how often different types of fuels might be sort of above or below that line. Yeah. Any questions? Okay, in the life cycle analysis of biofuels, so in a different, so this is one of the other studies, and you can see in their sort of boundary conditions what is included right here. In this one, they explicitly have the combustion of bioethanol within the vehicle, but they include that as sort of a circular part where as you grow the crop, you can have uptake of the CO2. So similar type of thing, but the boundary conditions may change your answers slightly. So in this study, we can see sort of, again, the components. This is similar to that bar chart from before, all the sort of components of the emissions. And we can see that in this case, the land use change in the red for your ethanol, for corn ethanol, is quite a bit lower. And that's because they're only considering sort of the direct land use change. And what that ends up doing is making your sort of final result cleaner than gasoline. And you can see here what the corn looks like with and without land use change, direct land use change. Yeah, and so in this comparison, the biggest difference, particularly sort of in the most controversial one, which is the corn feedstock, is whether or not you include this whole sort of red bar here. Okay. So other things to think about besides emissions, some of the market effects. How does the renewable fuel standards affect corn production? So we can see sort of very shortly after the RFS was implemented, the share of corn going into producing ethanol sort of really exploded. Okay, and so that sort of draws down from most of what corn is used for, which is feed. Yeah, in case you didn't know, the amount of corn that we use as sort of direct consumption or for like processed food, think about like high fructose corn syrup, that sort of thing. It's actually a very small proportion, maybe 5 to 10%, but most of it goes as feed for cattle. And that amount proportionally has decreased, right? Even if the sort of volume has planted acres has gone up. We can see here what the yields in planted acres look like relative to one another, and importantly, what has happened to corn prices as a result of this. So essentially, when you have some relatively fixed supply, and then you introduce a lot more demand for ethanol production, prices are going to go up. And so we can see this sort of quadrupling in price over a period of like 10 years. Okay. Yeah, so this is going to sort of transition us to talking about the low carbon fuel standard. So before we leave the world of RFS, does anyone have any last minute questions about it? Okay. So we'll keep in mind some of these issues, which are going to be sort of recurring within the sort of LCFS world, and maybe in greater debate. Okay. So the low carbon fuel standard. So this is a California-ish policy. Other states and some other like provinces and territories have also enacted low carbon fuel standards, but started out in California. So this was enacted back in 2007 by Governor Schwarzenegger at the time. So this was right around the time that AB 32 was passed, and so for those who are less familiar, so AB 32 is California's greenhouse gas emissions requirements. It was basically, or it basically requires the state to reach a greenhouse target in 2050, where we get 80% reduction below 1990 levels by that time period, and that is a significant piece of both as an executive order and also as legislation, because it sort of prompted a whole bunch of climate policies. So basically any climate policy you can think of, LCFS, cap and trade, ZEV mandates, all of these things kind of happen because of AB 32. So sort of at a cursory glance, LCFS looks a lot like RFS, right? They both promote switching from petroleum to alternative fuels, but the mechanism and the goals of these two policies are really different. So RFS basically is this, I would kind of describe it as this big subsidy to farmers, right? The idea is to reduce petroleum use, and then you do get potentially emissions benefit. But the LCFS is specifically aimed at reducing emissions, and because that is the intent of the policy, we'll find that the sort of mechanism and structure of the policy is going to be pretty different, and you can see how that's reflected in the design of the policy. The EPA administers RFS, and in a similar sense, the sort of analog at the state level, the California Air Resources Board is responsible for administrating the LCFS. And back in 2007, this executive order by Schwarzenegger basically required CARB to coordinate with the University of California and the California Energy Commission and other state agencies to propose some kind of schedule for LCFS going out to 2020. And this was led by our fearless leader, Dan Sperling, at Davis, and then by another guy, Alexander Farrell at UC Berkeley. And so a lot of the sort of spearheading in research prior to the design of the standards was done by teams here in Berkeley. And one of the unique things about this, right, is that with the RFS, it's this regulation that kind of just gets put together by the EPA. But they wanted a lot of sort of scientific backing for the LCFS, and they wanted to get it right. And so this is a really nice sort of case study, an example of bridging policy and science, right? And employing modeling techniques to help inform the way we design policy. Okay, so this is your AB32 target in 2050, right? And so these were at the time the sort of historical emissions. The gray boxes are kind of like, okay, if we go business as usual, emissions kind of will continue to increase year over year, but we need to get from sort of the end of this blue line eventually down to there. Back then, emissions in the US was dominated by electric power. We've talked about how that has switched due to the use of natural gas, but in California, since we don't have really any coal, actually the dominant source of emissions at the time and still today is transportation. And then here are the sort of dominant fuel types and emissions associated with them within the sort of transportation sector in their sort of baseline year. Again, this was nearly 20 years ago at that point. And so the idea is, for all of these fuels, can we start to replace these things and make them cleaner? Okay. So we have talked about these set of plots before, but this is sort of these cost of production figures for our gasoline baseline. So I can produce from conventional oil, enhanced oil recovery, tar sands, heavy oils, and then sort of synthetic fuels. And as you go from left to right, typically it's going to get a little bit more expensive. Okay, and so the order in which we produce these things tends to go from cheapest to most expensive. However, the emissions associated with production does not necessarily go from lowest to highest if you follow this order. And so one of the things you want to do is to make the cost figures and the ordering of production align with the emissions. And it's a tricky thing to do. There's lots of uncertainty and variability. So just with gasoline, you already have some kind of things to work with. I'm not even talking about going to alternative fuels. And by providing some kind of, let's say, monetary signal, you can kind of reshift some of these orderings to make sure that you are going up the emissions pathway in a sort of better way. Forecasting future consumption. So we've talked about forecasting before. In fact, the vision model, right? That's this sort of stock turnover model was one of the original models being used to do some of the forecasts here. We can see how well have some of the forecasts done relative to what we can now see retrospectively as historical data for gasoline sales by refiners in California. Yeah, and so it's kind of interesting being able to now go back and look at some of the modeling techniques, some of the forecasting techniques, right, that we've talked about, such as vision, and how it did relative to reality, and actually not so bad, actually, because they were there was sort of a corresponding decrease in the last decade that I guess they kind of foresaw coming. This is an example, a rare case where you get the forecast maybe relatively correct. Biofuel costs. So cost estimates for production. This is similar to some of the LCA studies that we were looking at before, thinking about breakdowns of a lot of these things. And so this will help go into understanding kind of the capabilities of different fuel producers to meet specific obligations and whether you're pushing the lever too little or too much. Getting a sense of some of the uncertainties and the reasons for those uncertainties is a sort of driving factor for some of the decision making and how you would design some of the standards. Same thing here, right? For understanding electricity costs, sort of understanding. This is like an example of your sort of dispatch curve at different times. You might have sort of a lot less of these and of lower cost production at certain times because they might be sort of unavailable. You can think of like renewables at nighttime or solar at nighttime. So again, there was, without having to worry about sort of the nuances and details of this, there was a lot of thought about influences of shifting to these alternative fuels on costs and ultimately prices to sort of end users. Okay. So this is kind of like the punchline table of a lot of that research, okay? The GREET model is a model out of Argonne that helps to determine emissions intensities of different fuels. And that was what was being employed by a lot of these UC studies and by the CEC in helping to inform CARB, the sort of initial emissions estimates. Okay, and so we can see, so the first one, RFG, that's just our baseline gasoline, so 92 grams per megajoule, and then a bunch of your other potential alternative fuels down here. Again, you'll notice that ethanol, there are a whole bunch of different ways you can produce it, and they have sort of associated emissions, different emissions with it. And so actually even today, like depending on the process in which you produce ethanol, you might gain sort of different amounts of credits because the emissions associated with a particular production pathway would be different. Okay, any questions about this? So introducing LCA into policy. In that, so what I'll say is this is not this table is not the sort of final one. And that's because there were sort of concerns associated with LCA and policy. So the analysis conducted with GREET had some specific concerns that folks here were pointing to. So consequential effects, and so this is sort of related to these three. So the land use change, climate impacts of the emissions, and then, okay, separately, the sort of variability and limited quality in the data. Okay, so direct and indirect land use change. So I think this is a nice little figure that maybe better summarizes what I was talking about before. Let's suppose you just know requirements for bioenergy. You've got two regions that are both doing food production. Okay, and so you have some corn being produced here and some corn being produced here. And so what I would say sort of really analogously is like we would think in this context, right? It's a lot of, so this, you might consider this to be the US and this would be like Brazil. So bioenergy production, so suddenly you have requirements to produce biofuels. And so the way that people had traditionally measured direct land use change, we don't really consider this guy over here. Instead, we say, okay, we'll just produce more crops and those will be used for biofuels, and then you can have some associated production emissions associated with that and land use change. But here, what happens is you switch over from your food production to fuel production. And this might be the case, this might be more common if you have constraints in use or based on ability to produce the crops. And then you might have some international market interactions where this might be happening in a different country where they're where they'll be not replacing their food production, maybe doing like deforestation and that sort of thing in order to meet that demand, right? And the reason this happens is that when you suddenly have new demand and you need to produce supply for that, you probably want to go with the sort of cheapest source of supply. And if you look at that sort of globally, for the US, some of the cheapest that can be produced is coming from deforestation of land in Brazil, which you convert into cropland. And that's where this sort of idea comes from. Okay, and so we can see that there were some adjustments within LCA models where they adjusted for the well-to-wheels emissions associated with land use change. And we can see how that changes the values of both biodiesel production from Midwest soybeans and ethanol production from Midwest corn ethanol to be substantially higher. And actually, again, these values both are higher than your default of gasoline. Yeah, and so this is, you can imagine that this, this table, it might be representing some kind of like academic debates about, differences between what we would consider within the model and whether, assumptions are correct and that sort of thing, right? But from a stakeholder perspective, that difference is really important because it means the difference between making a lot of money or not being used at all, right? So this ends up being a sort of significance issue in the design of the standard. So we'll talk about once we get to sort of the policy formation and some of how stakeholders are getting involved, how that got really contentious. Okay, So okay, so we have an end goal target in 2020 to reduce our grams of CO2 down to 79 grams of CO2 per megajoule, down from 88, which is your sort of initial starting point. And so that's pretty good. That's more than a 10% decrease in emissions of fuels being used in California. Okay. So there's a bunch of different ways we can get there. We can go there in a straight line. We can do this different sort of thing, rationalize, accelerating, tech forcing. And there are maybe different reasons why you would do this. Okay, and so let's say the more conservative one, the blue line, technology forcing, it gives a little bit more leeway, right? There's more time for automakers, or not automakers, fuel producers to get their act together and have a couple years before they really need to decrease. There's one where you start out big and then you sort of accelerate down towards your target. Okay, so who can tell me from a purely emissions perspective, which one of these is the best? Anyone? Yes. Yeah, and why is that? Yep. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And this is a so this is a common thing that people forget about, which is that, and this kind of applies to climate change targets in general, which is like, okay, we have a target, and as long as we meet that target, right, we're good. You've met your sort of climate change goals. And so if everyone gets to this point in 2020, in that year, those emissions will all sort of be the same, okay? But in all the years prior to this, right, this rationalized guy is emitting less than every other one, and then in the next year it's emitting less, and so on and so forth. And climate change cares about, it doesn't care about the rate, it cares about the cumulative amount of like CO2 in the atmosphere. And CO2 doesn't go away for hundreds of years, right? And so anything that you sort of emit is going to stick around. And so if you had a compliance target that went out that way and then dropped down, that'd be a lot worse than something that goes lower at the beginning. So one thing to keep in mind as you think about ways to meet to meet any particular targets, the more aggressive and stringent you are at the beginning, all of those gains are going to sort of compound. Okay. So again, kind of like I was mentioning, the sort of research study is this really nice type of representation of connecting science directly with policy. And in this case, there were sort of 22 specific recommendations to the design of the LCFS. So things like covering providers of non-liquid fuels, and this did end up happening. Upstream emissions should be included. So that includes land use change. This one was this one was a particularly nice idea, which is one of the nice, particularly I think nice things that about the way that LCFS operates right now. Basically, the credits that you receive from LCFS is based off of the emissions difference that you have with gasoline. Okay, and so if you produce a fuel, there's some pathway in which you produce it, and then you receive credits based on that difference. And there are what I would call these sort of default values for any particular pathway that are like pretty pessimistic. And so you would be receiving less credits than maybe you think you deserve. And so the way this works is if you produce the fuel and you submit to get RFS credits or LCFS credits, they use the default values unless you can certify that you that your production pathway has lower emissions. And so this gives an economic signal to fuel producers to not only demonstrate that they can produce lower emissions, but it's an actual signal for them to try and reduce the emissions to the biggest extent possible, right? To get more credits. And so this is a nice sort of way to get people to want to do that. There's a whole market for credits. And there is certification and auditing of a lot of the production. Yeah, and then some environmental justice and sustainability issues, which is really sort of ahead of the time for regulation that's happening in the sort of late 2000s. Program review and cost analysis. I think this was probably going to happen anyways. And of course, universities want more research, so get more research funding. But okay, so 2009 ruling. So they incorporated a lot of the recommendations from the 2007 studies. They conducted a bunch of public workshops to get engagement with stakeholders and the public. A lot of the studies were submitted for external peer review. So the process of regulation forming here, you can see is pretty similar to some of the rulemaking that happens at the federal level, right? That we talked about last class. Okay. So rulemaking finalized in 2009 and slated to begin the rule over a decade ago on January 1st, 2011. So in 2009, Renewable Fuels Association, right? So these guys potentially stand to gain a lot of money if the analysis points out that ethanol is below gasoline emissions, and if it's above, then no one is going to produce, right? Because then you have to pay a lot of money. So these are the sort of US ethanol lobbying groups. They filed a lawsuit to challenge the constitutionality of LCFS. And so there was an injunction against implementing LCFS in December of 2011. So this ended up, an injunction means that they had to stop enforcing the rule. And in April of 2012, there was a stay of that injunction. And it's been actually continuously gone through a whole sort of suite of lawsuits, appeals, all of which were lost. Okay, the most recent just last month. That's from last year's slide. So 1 year and a month ago, actually the Ninth Circuit ruled in favor of California. So basically, they're home free. LCFS has been around and has has lowered the emissions rate associated with fuel use in California. Okay. All right, so that's kind of the background for how it came about and thinking about this idea of modeling associated with outcomes in LCFS. But let's talk about how this actually works. So unlike RFS, which is basically saying, okay, you need some amount of fuel, LCFS works by having an intensity target in terms of grams of CO2 per megajoule. You can kind of think of it similar to the CAFE standards for emissions, right? Except that it spans across a variety of different fuels. And then also it includes the well-to-wheels life cycle analysis rather than just the tailpipe, which is what the greenhouse gas emission standards currently do at the federal level. The performance standard framework means that you don't pick winners and losers, right? Whatever fuel, I don't care what fuel it is, reduces emissions intensity, then you get credits based off those reductions. And those targets will tighten over time. Yeah, so the regulation is imposed on the fuel provider, either the manufacturer or importer of the transportation fuels. So carbon intensity of fuels includes not only CO2, but also other greenhouse gas emissions. So this tries to get at the sort of total effect on climate change. So CO2, N2O, black carbon, that sort of thing. So methane is actually a big one. Methane is sort of many times worse than CO2 in terms of greenhouse gas warming. And yeah, one of the things that you can do is try to sort of displace emissions from methane. One of the ones that people think about is pretty interesting is like cattle actually emit a lot of methane. They call them cow farts, but actually it's coming from cows that burp up methane. And actually a lot of agricultural like farmers who raise cattle get a whole ton of LCFS credits because if they replace the feed of cows from sort of traditional feeds, which lead to cows burping and having these methane emissions, they can change I think they feed them like seaweed, kind of seaweed diet or something like that. And that actually decreases methane emissions from these sources, and they're able to claim LCFS credits. It's kind of a, sorry, what was that?
If that is a substantial amount of methane used.
I don't know how substantial it is, but every little bit counts, I guess. I actually don't know like the sort of absolute quantity, but methane is really bad. Yeah, it could be 20 to 30 times worse than CO2. So relative amounts is sort of proportionally higher. Yeah, but farmers have been able to take it. This is one of the like weirder nuanced cases of being able to claim LCFS credits. Yeah.
It's still smaller than on the leakage, but
Yep.
you know,
Leakage is harder to deal with.
yeah.
But it's kind of interesting because it shows that that the market signal kind of pervades across many different mechanisms of emissions production. And so if you were to do something like a targeted type of thing, let's say, you know, if I were just to focus on like light duty vehicles with something like a ZEV mandate, like that would be an example of something that you might miss. And so, you know, this is the sort of argument that that economists will point to when it comes to sort of picking winners and losers. You might miss out on stuff like that. Okay, the carbon intensity of fuels are also adjusted for inherent drivetrain differences. So gasoline is the default is 1, and then electricity and hydrogen are going to be a lot lower. Okay, and the reason for this, right, is the relative efficiency difference of your drivetrain is different. So the electricity being used in a car is going to get you more miles on an energy basis than gasoline, right? So this is an important nuance. If I'm talking about carbon intensity of just the fuels, right, the fuels that go into the car, you should not be comparing them on a one-to-one basis, because what those fuels can do in your car is going to be different. Okay. Electricity is going to go on an energy basis 3 times farther than gasoline will do on an energy basis in your car. And so when you do your carbon intensity, you have to modify the values by these differences in the drivetrain. So this is one of the more sort of recent ones that we see here for carbon intensity. You have your baseline values for diesel here, and for gasoline, that's the top one, CARB OB over there. And so the electricity is going to be at sort of this range, but remember that there's this sort of adjustment thing that happens. And same with hydrogen. So these are actual carbon intensity values associated with the program. Remember what I was saying, that by default, producers get a specific pathway value, and that default value is going to be your rightmost diamond. Okay, but if you can demonstrate that your production pathway is cleaner, then you can claim a different carbon intensity value. And that's actually what you see here. All of these other diamonds are real fuel producers showing CARB, hey, we can get different values than the default pathway. And those have been certified, and then they are able to claim a sort of larger amount of credit from production of particular fuels. You might be wondering, okay, so here's 0. What the heck are all these guys here? And so they're actually demonstrating that the production of the fuel can lead to a net decrease in CO2. So they're actually pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. I don't know exactly what these are, what's happening here. I would guess it's some kind of carbon sequestration activity. Okay. So what ended up happening? So there's a 10% reduction target by 2020. You can see before the litigation, there was this dotted line target. So that's, sorry, there's two dotted lines, the smaller dotted line here. That was before there was this LCFS litigation. And we can see the historic compliance curves with the solid lines. And because the litigation kind of pushed everything back and there was a lot of uncertainty about whether producers would do it, the compliance curve didn't actually go where they sort of wanted. And so they had to have a more sort of aggressive reduction to meet the targets. There was, if you look at where they actually went, which is the sort of green line, it's quite a bit below the black line, which means that there was a bank of credits getting built up by producers, and then credits were drawn down in order to meet some of the sort of increased stringency requirements. Okay, so we've talked about this. Indirect land use change ended up getting included. And so this really drove out any possibility of doing sort of domestic corn produced ethanol for LCFS compliance. Yeah, there was a big alliance representing biofuels companies that questioned the validity of indirect land use change. And basically a bunch of scientists and economists got together to urge the Air Resources Board to include indirect land use change. And this ended up happening, drastically sort of penalizing domestic ethanol production. There are, this debate has been somewhat settled, but from an academic perspective, there is a lot of uncertainty about this. Like, how do you actually know that, what you're doing is leading to sort of deforestation in Brazil? And if we bypass it and we say we're not doing it, you're not able to like experimentally determine that it happened, right? And so there's substantial uncertainty, and there continues to be sort of substantial uncertainty in this area, but we basically have concluded that that with the land use change, the production emissions are going to be higher, and therefore don't even sort of pursue it. And then when you consider the sort of distribution, this is similar to that study we looked at for RFS. This is actually by the same group of authors from Carnegie Mellon, thinking about this in terms of determining life cycle emissions as it relates to ethanol for LCFS policy. Again, because of the indirect land use change, you have substantial uncertainty about whether or not you end up sort of to the right or to the left of your sort of gasoline baseline. Okay, so talking about participants and credits. So you have this sort of mechanism for how credits get awarded. So you have what's known as regulated parties. So these are your petroleum importers, refiners, wholesalers, and then all of your approved alternative fuel producers. Anytime transportation fuels are imported or refined or they are sold within California, that gets entered into this LCFS reporting tool, the LRT. And then you have credits that are awarded or there's a deficit tracked for every regulated party. So if I sell petroleum in California and I am selling, at this 90 grams per megajoule and the target is at 80 grams per megajoule, I end up with a deficit of credits. I get this sort of negative credit allocation because I'm selling fuels that are more carbon intense than what is allowed. And then now I have to go and demonstrate to CARB that I can make that up. So I have to buy credits from people who are producing, let's say there's some producer of some fuel that's at like 70 grams per megajoule. They are getting a bunch of credits because they're lower than this 80-gram target. So I buy all those credits from them, they get to make money, and then now I've satisfied my obligation to meet a carbon intensity requirement. So you can see how this market sort of incentivizes these alternative fuel producers, because if I make clean fuels, I get to sell the LCFS credits for some money. And that's like the money on top of whatever I'd be making for selling that alternative fuel. So this market mechanism penalizes people who emit a lot and reward people who emit less. Yeah, and so if you're a gasoline producer, I can do things like blend low carbon biofuels into my fuel. I can introduce alternative fuels. I can like get into natural gas or hydrogen or electricity, and then I can buy credits from other suppliers. The other one that people don't think about as much is that I can actually improve the efficiency of my operations, which will possibly lower the life cycle emissions to an extent such that, right, you're getting penalized less. Okay. So obviously gasoline is still being sold, and so you have some negative amounts of credits. That's everything that you see below this line here. The white is going to be your gasoline, and then this gray black piece is going to be your diesel. And all of the credits that go below have to get made up, right? And so those are made up by a bunch of other sort of fuel, alternative fuels. So for a while, it's certain pathways of ethanol and diesel. And then where is electricity? Here we go. So electricity here, on-road electricity, is this bar at the top. And this is back in 2014, I believe, 2014, 2015, 2016. And the amount going to electric vehicles, right, has grown sort of year on year. And I don't know if I actually have a more recent plot of that, but electricity is rapidly becoming one of the sort of dominant players in LCFS due to the popularity of electric vehicles. So how much are credits worth? In 2017, there were lots of banked credits, and credit deficits started rising higher than the credits coming in to balance them, right? Which means this is going to be particularly true as the standard kind of continues to fall, and this leads to a rise in credit prices. I think it's since fallen from this $200 sort of area. I think it's closer to like $100 right now. But in 2018, this definitely went up a bit. There was also, I would say, uncertainty. So LCFS was originally going out to 2020, and then in 2017, 2018 time period, there was a bunch of sort of updates to the LCFS, and it got extended out to 2030. Okay, I'm going to skip this one. We've talked about this. All right. So the last thing that we'll talk about is electricity in LCFS. Okay, so this is motivated by a lot of the sort of recent events in sort of electric vehicles, right? There's a big growth in this technology. And so this particular part of the policy is pretty interesting. And so, yeah, I thought we'd do a little bit of a deeper dive here. So LCFS has two main goals: promote the production and use of alternative fuels, and promote the reduction in carbon intensity of fuels. So there's something interesting about electricity, which is unlike gasoline and diesel and biofuels and hydrogen and all these other sorts of fuels, that electricity gets used for other things other than transportation, right? And so there isn't actually any issue with supply as there is with other fuels, but rather it has to do with demand from vehicles. And so you don't need to induce people to use more electricity like you would with more, hydrogen or more biofuels. So really kind of what you want to do at the end of the day is to increase the demand from vehicles. And so you want to actually incentivize electric vehicle sales. And that's what makes this kind of fundamentally different from other pieces of LCFS. It also makes it really tricky because if so there's this question of who is the regulated party? Okay, so one of the trickier things is that how do you track the electricity is getting used in the car and not for my computer, my lights, or my fridge? And so who would you go about sort of adding as a regulated party? Would it be the providers for your charging stations, right? But then what about if they're not charging at a public station? Are you going to do it with the utilities? Right? How will the utilities be able to track these things? There are a lot of sort of nuances about electricity within the LCFS that makes it very tricky. And then last thing I'll say, so LCFS promotes reduction of carbon intensity, right, through use of different fuels or more efficient pathways. So how does that happen in electricity? Well, we have an electricity grid that's made up of natural gas plants and hydro and solar and wind. Does LCFS actually promote a reduction in carbon intensity of the grid? Yeah, it's not. It's a lot less straightforward, right? There are a whole bunch of steps in between who gets the money and then going up to that sort of upstream sort of power providers on the grid. Okay, so right now the majority of credits are being awarded to utilities. So these are the default credit generators on behalf of residential PEV charging. So 80% of charging happens at home. And so by default, these guys are the ones who receive the credits. Other fuel providers currently include, some of the lists that I was mentioning before: service providers, fleet operators, transit agencies, for people who are doing electric buses. Battery switch station owners could get them if there were any that existed. Okay. So how many credits do we give to utilities? So allocation of credits to utilities are a function of electricity use, and then function of the electricity carbon intensity. So the ARB has some estimates based on number of vehicles that aren't metered times the daily average PEV electricity use times the number of days in the compliance period. This is their thing. Okay. So one of the issues is that this is assumed to be equal to the use for separately metered vehicles. Okay, so what's the problem here? So utilities want to claim credits for these EVs. There's a bunch of electric vehicles in PG&E, but I don't have separate meters for all these electric vehicles. So how do I know how many credits that I get? There are a very small number of vehicles within PG&E that actually has a separate meter for their electric vehicles. So we take those readings and then we say, that's what the rest of the electric vehicles in my service territory look like. And so this is like a real current issue these days. Well, back in 2017, there were like a couple hundred cars out of a couple 100,000 vehicles that had separate meters. So you're trying to represent 100,000 vehicles with less than a 1% representation. And do you guys think that people who own separate meters for their electric cars behave the same way that someone who, well, let's say your average electric vehicle owner? Probably not, right? And so this is probably not a really good way to measure it. But unfortunately, there isn't necessarily a much sort of better metric of doing this. And then there's been a lot of sort of discussion on how you might try and improve something like this. The other thing is that there is no, really the end of the day, we want to lower emissions, right? That's the whole point of LCFS, carbon intensity. Remember that electric vehicle carbon intensity is also a function of time. So this is the carbon intensity of the grid over a 24-hour period, right? And so if you are charging in the afternoon, morning to afternoon, you can have 3.5 times lower emissions than if you're charging, say, at nighttime. But with LCFS, they don't really have a way of sort of dealing with that, right? And so there's no signal to say charge at a different time. And so this is another sort of modern era issue that kind of remains unresolved, but potentially has sort of big carbon implications. Yeah, so these are issues that may be worth looking into. Yeah, in the future, if people are interested in doing this kind of research. Yeah. There are requirements. So, okay, so when a fuel, let's think not electricity. If I'm a fuel provider, and I produce some biofuels or hydrogen or something, all of that money is going towards this company that's producing alternative fuels. Okay, and so to us that makes sense. You're doing these economic rewards to these people who are making cleaner fuels. What about for utilities who get LCFS credits? Are they are not producing alternative fuels that are sort of cleaner than gasoline, right? That's not kind of the mission statement of a electric utility, right? And so specifically for electricity, there are rules for how they can use money associated with credits from LCFS. So this is determined by the Public Utilities Commission. And there are these sort of generic rules sort of to benefit current or future electric vehicle customers and to educate the public on the benefits of EV transportation. And they have to provide rate options that encourage off-peak charging and minimize adverse impacts to the electricity grid. So this is a way that you can get some of those benefits we were showing from this slide, is to try and get them to charge at sort of better times. Which is a slow process. I don't think that they're doing a particularly good job of that right now. And specifically, investor-owned utilities have to help to reduce the purchase or lease costs of PEVs or to apply an annual credit against a customer's bill. They cannot use it to pay for charging infrastructure. There's a separate process for that. Yeah, so it's kind of interesting, this whole world. I think that one of the things, one of the really big differences here is that a lot of the way that the revenues are redistributed is that you get this like one-time award per vehicle, which is a really big departure from the way LCFS works with other fuels. Right, we think about the more hydrogen you use, the more biofuels you use, etc., the more credits that are being generated, and then those credits then go, those credits are entirely based off of how much you use the vehicle. It's kind of interesting for the utilities. They also get money based off of how much you use the vehicle, right? Because they have all this data from the meters. But then the customers are only given a one-time use that is nothing to do with how you use the vehicle. And so there is kind of a misalignment of incentives in this case. But yeah, these are all sorts of rebates that you're getting from, that customers end up getting through the LCFS program. Yeah. No, but there should be. Yeah, I mean, separate meters are pretty expensive. And yeah, I mean, thinking about, one of the problems is that like, you probably wouldn't want to spend all of the revenue from LCFS just to do measurement and data collection, right? There's probably more efficient ways than like trying to meter everybody. And that's, you know, one of the common arguments these days about thinking about how you would better structure this is like, well, instead of taking these non-representative metered ones, metered vehicles to represent everyone else, maybe you could like rely on some studies that have looked at how people drive their electric vehicles on average, which is probably a better indicator than using metered data. Yeah, so. Yeah, so there's been a lot of discussion about how the credit allocation should be should be done, a lot of back and forth between what ARB is trying to regulate and what the PUC objectives are. And so you want to encourage electric vehicle adoption. You want to make sure you have equitable returns to your drivers, minimize grid impacts, and probably the one of the biggest ones, and related to maybe this metering issue, is you want to limit administrative complexity, because if the costs of administration are higher than the revenues that you're raising, no one's really going to want to do it. Okay, so I think we're actually going to let's end here. Success of scientifically backed policy. So I'll just sort of close out saying the benefits of the policy have been really, really immense. So estimated to reduce over 20 million metric tons of CO2, and has been attributed to hundreds of millions of dollars in productivity that's associated with the improvements in air quality. And this is, again, one of these now, I would say, sort of classic case studies of really successfully linking scientific modeling with policymaking. And yeah, I mean, if you're in the realm of like sustainability, climate change, that sort of thing, this is the type of impact that you want to make, right? This is how you translate research papers into like real world impact. Yeah, and I think that one of the nice things about being at Davis is that we're so close to Sacramento. So there's a lot of, I think, opportunity to do this kind of thing. So, okay, cool. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, we'll have class on Thursday, and make sure homeworks will be due at the end of the day on Thursday. Okay.